Every time.
Good morning. I'm Mark Robbins. I'm the president of the American Academy in Rome, and I'm delighted to see you all here. I'm looking forward to the next few days, as I know you all are. I think Marla's organized yet another wonderful conference, and we're looking forward to hearing all of the speakers, and we're looking forward to the discussion over the next 2 days over coffee and over meals while you're here with us. So the conference theme, of course, Citizen and Identity in Italy and the US, is about contested space and the struggles between culture and the kind of ongoing battle for agency and a public voice. So I, of course, want to acknowledge Marla, our Andrew Mellon Humanities Professor at the Academy, our Director, Elisa Wong, as well as Julia Barra, Tina Kanchemi, and Neil Colson for their support of this and all of the programs, really, at the American Academy in Rome. Thank you again to the speakers for coming and joining us at the Academy. We're delighted to have you. Questions of identity have been an increasing part of the discourse of academic and cultural institutions in museums and universities and across public space. The Academy itself has always been a reflection, a microcosm of culture in the United States, often representing dominant modes of thinking about art and scholarship, which again reflect our sense of history, the way history is interpreted, analyzed, and represented. In our programming in the past years, we have interrogated our own history as a way of thinking more critically about the role of the United States in a global setting to determine ideas about culture, about history, and about the future. We, of course, look in high relief in Italy about what it means to be an American from an outside view. And Rome, which has always been a place of flux and multi-cultured flows, is a great place in which to have this discussion. Represents our aspirations, our identity, and looks at the interconnectedness between myth and the realities of daily life and what our expectations of citizenship are. So our renewed efforts at the Academy look beyond the boundaries of the city of Rome. We look at the broader context of the Mediterranean and tease out narratives that often aren't presented or haven't been presented widely enough. And so I think this conference comes at a remarkable time. It will underscore the ways in which signifiers of power and affiliation change form, and that the struggles for nationhood and agency continue to this current day. So thank you once again. I want to bring to the podium Marla Stone. She's a historian of the First Order whose work brings to light complex readings of the fascist era with an exceptional sensitivity to the relations between regime, propaganda, and visual culture. Marla Stone.
Thank you, Mark, and a big welcome to everyone. I'm so pleased to have this group of scholars who've come from the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Italy. So I think we're going to have a really wonderful conversation and debate over the next 2 days. I, like Mark, want to do a shout out and a thank you to our amazing staff that did the logistics to bring us all together. Julia Barra, Tina Kanchemi, Laura Cabeza, Stefano Jenna, who's running our tech, Ann Coulson, and of course, Elisa Wong, our director. So citizenship is really a relatively new concept, a relatively new idea of the relationship between the individual and the state and the nation. Born in the revolutionary 18th century, there's been a constant battle to define it, and a battle to expand it, to make it inclusive. There has simultaneously been, particularly in the reality we're living in now, a struggle against the notion of inclusive citizenship, marked by the presence of forces determined to limit who receives the title of citizen. Citizenship implies much more than the legal rights and responsibilities which are awarded with it. And I think that's our connection here, between the legal idea of citizenship and how it flows into national identity. So rather, through the process of defining and awarding citizenship, emerge the vectors of national identity, the political culture of a given nation, making any conversation or debate about citizenship really a debate about the shape of the nation. The question of who is considered worthy of the name citizen is about far more than legal status. Born as a radical possibility, rejecting the absolute power of a king, citizenship is intimately tied to the idea of national sovereignty and to the social contract between government and the governed. A citizen can demand change, can bring down a government, a subject cannot. So while its incarnations in the West originally sought only the inclusion of a broader range of white, property-owning males, the concept of citizenship, like so many Enlightenment concepts, contain within it the seeds of a broader and potentially universal vision. That vision has yet to be realized, another thing that's going to come up repeatedly in the next 2 days, but the search for the realization of a universal vision defined much of the 19th and 20th centuries through to today. And much of what we're going to hear about and discuss during this conference confronts exactly that contradiction and the ensuing struggles and contestations over who gets the privileges and protections of citizenship. Our speakers in the course of these 2 days are going to focus on questions of citizenship and identity at different historical moments and from different perspectives. Some of you look at it from the perspective of the forces interested in limiting the contours of the body politic, and others from the experience of those subjected to an exclusionary and persecutory definition of citizenship. Contemporary political conflicts about who is included in the body politic and who is excluded and who decides this move us all to look for connections between past and present, between struggles for equality and representation in different places and moments. So during our 2 days, we hope to pull out the ideological and practical tributaries that have produced contemporary contested definitions of citizenship. We will address the shifting nature of Italian-American citizenship and how the forces of nationalism, colonialism, racism, dictatorship, and immigration have produced it in the last 200 years. In the course of tracing how we got to contemporary notions of citizenship and identity, in the course of doing this, we were forced to ask what a modern Italian or modern American identity looks like. Italy and America, as we all know, in very different ways have been a crossroads of cultures and peoples. How does that shape our idea of citizenship and the meaning of citizenship? How did the experiences of ethnic, racial, and linguistic nationalism in the 19th century shape today's battles over inclusion? How did colonialism and empire challenge Italian identity and demands for citizenship? In Italy today, what is the connection between the struggles of Afro-Italians for citizenship and those journeying across the Mediterranean in search of a safe haven? So given the exciting variations in subject interpretation, this conference represents an opportunity to cross-fertilize, to debate, and to pull out new ideas. And it is a pleasure to be here in person in this beautiful place, something that was much more difficult last year when we hosted a conference. So we are opening today with a lecture by Stephanie Malia Hom. Professor Hom's lecture is entitled Villages, Camps, and Papers on the Dynamics of Citizenship in Italy. Professor Hom is a leading scholar of modern Italian studies whose work focuses on colonialism, race, and migration. Professor Hom has shaped the field of transnational Italian history and culture with really deeply innovative scholarship analyzing topics as varied as the culture and evolution of tourism in Italy and Italy's system of migrant detention. Professor Hom is Associate Professor of Transnational Italian Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and her groundbreaking books include, quite recently, Empire's Mobius Strip, Historical Echoes in Italy's Crisis of Migration and Detention. And then in 2015, she published The Beautiful Country, Tourism and the Impossible State of Destination Italy. She currently has two really exciting book projects in preparation, one entitled The Legacies of Slavery and Colonialism in Italy, and the second, Imperial Eclipse, Italian Colonial Fiction and Race, 1900 to 1960. Professor Hom has been the recipient of an extremely impressive array of fellowships, including the Rome Prize here at the American Academy, also the Charles A. Reiskamp Research Fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Stanford Humanities Center, the Lauro Di Bosis Lectureship at Harvard, and the Oscar Bronier Traveling Fellowship from the American School at Athens. And this is only a partial list. So with that in mind, I am very pleased to welcome Professor Stephanie Malia Hom to the podium. And we will, welcome Stephanie, we will we'll have time for some questions at the end of the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Marla, for that wonderful introduction and for setting the context of this incredible conference. And grazie di nuovo to President Mark Robbins and to Director Lisa Wong and the rest of the Academy team for bringing us together for this conference to hold what promises to be a generative, collaborative, and timely conversation about citizenship and identity in Italy and the US. I am honored to be giving the opening keynote among scholars here today whose work I have long admired for years. Scholars who have not only influenced me, but who have also pushed me to think and rethink the critical questions and methodological approaches that I engage in my own work about Italy and Italian identities. It is also fitting that we hold this conference here in Rome, the Eternal City, Caput Mundi, home of the Civitates, where gradations of citizenship emerged in their earliest forms, and as well as here at the American Academy in Rome, where interdisciplinary conversation animates every endeavor of this institution. Indeed, it is in the sustained interactions between scholars and artists here that new ideas and inspirations emerge from the interstices of our intellectual and artistic enterprises. And it is in this spirit of close colloquy and interdisciplinary inquiry that I set the intention of this keynote, which I hope will both connect as well as raise questions for all of us in our conversations in the days to come. Beyond the runway of the Ciampino Airport, there exists a villaggio attrezzato, an equipped village known as La Barbuta, that was built by the Italian state in 2011 to house hundreds of Roma who were forcibly displaced from their campi nomadi, or nomad camps. Their dislocation was part of a nationwide effort to mitigate Italy's so-called problema zingari, or gypsy problem, by razing decades-old settlements, most famously Casalino Novecento here in Rome, and resettling thousands of Romani residents into government-built villages, which can best be described as high-security trailer parks. La Barbuta was one of 8 villaggi constructed across the Roman periphery in the wake of this mass displacement. I drove out to this site while conducting research for my last book, Empire's Mobius Strip, with the idea of simply having a look around and taking some notes, maybe taking some pictures. When I got there, the first thing that I noticed about La Barbuta was the trash. There were piles of rubbish so high that from a distance I could barely see the red rooftops of its trailers. Innumerable garbage bags, discarded mattresses, old toilets, construction debris, and every other imaginable dross littered the road leading into the village. I thought, at first glance, the sea of trash surrounding the village seemed to reinforce the stereotype about the Roma as being dirty and uncivilized, people who, in being refused by society, were figuratively and physically conflated with refuse itself. What happened next surprised me. I discovered that adjacent to this government-built village, there was a campo nomadi that had existed on the site for the better part of 2 decades, and I was invited in by the men and women living there. They wanted to tell me their story. Specifically, they wanted to tell me how unfairly and unjustly they had been treated by the Italian state. Noi siamo italiani, vedi come il governo ci tratta. We are Italians, and look at how the government treats us, said one resident F in his interview with me. The residents of the nomad camp were all Italians belonging to the Sinti ethnic minority, a smaller subset of the larger community of European Roma. Everyone I spoke with at the camp lamented the fact that they could not live in the village next door because it was reserved for non-Italian Roma. I was told that it was a great injustice that the government handed out houses to foreign-born Roma, but they, as Italian citizens, got nothing. Whether or not they were citizens in the eyes of the Italian law, however, is another question. Many of the residents I interviewed had been born in Turin and had traveled the country as part of a carnival troupe, eventually settling in Rome when their fair closed down. Italy's law of jus sanguinis, or bloodline citizenship, accords citizenship on the basis of kinship, not birthplace, which is contrary to jus solis, the literally citizenship by soil, the law of citizenship that applies in the United States. Just because these Sinti residents were born in Italy and had lived here all their lives does not mean they are Italian citizens. It was unclear to me if any of the residents possessed documenti, or papers, legitimizing their claims of citizenship. Numerous scholars have pointed out the irony and the injustice inherent in, for example, third-generation Brazilians with Italian great-grandfathers gaining Italian citizenship without so much as speaking the language or ever stepping foot on Italian territory, whereas second-generation, third-generation children of immigrants who were born and raised here in Italy have little or no path to citizenship. For members of this seconda generazione in Italy, the law of jus sanguinis leads to bureaucratic quagmires that can be best described as Kafkaesque. By way of one example, for some members of the Sinti community who either missed the narrow window to apply for citizenship between the ages of 18 and 19 years old, or did not have the requisite permessi, or permits, their only recourse to apply for Italian citizenship was to declare statelessness, despite the fact that they lived in Italy their entire lives. For this reason, among others, citizenship has taken center stage on the agenda of seconda generazione activists in Italy today. Yet citizenship is anything but a static category. It is best understood perhaps, as Daphne Birdall notes, as, quote, an ongoing process, a social complex, and a cultural performance that encapsulates contradictory struggles over the definition of social membership, over categories and practices of inclusion and exclusion, and over different forms of participation in public life. Indeed, the cutting-edge scholarship, generated by many of you in this room, interrogates with elegance and nuance the complex processes and tensions that give rise to gradated forms of citizenship in Italy and beyond, whether these are forms of special or minor citizenship in the Italian colonies, citizenship accorded to allogeny or linguistic minorities in places like Slovenia and South Tyrol, indefinite citizenship taken up by rimpatriati, repatriates from the colonies and from Istria, the problematics of jus sanguinis posed by children of mixed-race unions, and in the case of the United States, the partial forms of citizenship granted to those born in U.S. territories like American Samoa, or still others in the U.S., like those from Washington, D.C., or from Guam, who are citizens but who are represented by non-voting members of Congress. Returning to Berdahl's idea that citizenship is a contradictory struggle cited in categories and practices of inclusion and exclusion, our scholarship collectively explores how this contest simultaneously produces exclusionary spaces and marginalized subjects on one hand, and creates the structural conditions for moral and political inclusion within state and society on the other. I propose taking a closer look at this supposition, and specifically the relationship between inclusion and exclusion, which subtends the very concept of citizenship itself. This relationship is by no means symmetrical, and in fact, I would argue that exclusionary logics tend to dominate what is, at heart, the dynamic of citizenships. By logics, I intend a set of principles that inform a disposition that becomes realized in practice, similar to the way that Edward Said describes Orientalism as having a textual attitude, with the corpus of Orientalist works forming a body of knowledge that makes a preposterous transition from text to practice. I would argue that citizenship, as we understand it in the West, with its roots grounded in Greek and Roman law, has an exclusionary impulse, a drive that focuses its energies principally on negatory actions, actions like blocking, banning, and refusing membership in a given society or a given community. To put it another way, in the context of citizenship, what becomes more important is who gets left out and how, rather than who is deemed worthy of inclusion by the state. Today, these processes of exclusion go by myriad names: marginalization, segregation, alienation, dislocation, disenfranchisement, all of which serve to reify the state's refusal. In a village like La Barbuta, I have argued that the Italian state harnesses inscriptions of race, ethnicity, and nationality to put its stamp on its subjects, and that stamp is either the recognition or, more commonly, the refusal of citizenship. I would like to take this opportunity in this talk to ask and to just explore with you how these exclusionary logics operate over the longue durée. Certainly, we can draw immediate connections between the shifting constellations of minor citizenship instituted in Italy's colonies, for instance, all of the permutations of cittadinanza speciale italiana, or special Italian citizenship in places like Libya, and the contemporary confusion caused by the ever-changing requirements for Italian citizenship today, perhaps best exemplified by the proposal of jus culturae, or citizenship by culture, which has long been mired in the Italian parliament. Or we could focus attention on the exclusionary measures that differentiated citizens, subjects, and subjects of the realm, cittadini, sudditi, and renicoli, in the context of Italian colonialism in the 19th century, late 19th century, and ask in what ways these measures might articulate with, for example, naturalization laws in neighboring France, or even earlier, proto-national forms of belonging in places like the republics of Venice and Genoa. What did it mean to live and exist in, among, and under these structures of governance over time, and how did the experience of belonging, or more to the point, the experience of being excluded from these communities shape the modern dynamics of citizenship in Italy? A spotlight on exclusionary logics also, unsurprisingly, raises the idea of constitutive exclusion, a concept identified by Giorgio Agamben as being proper to the figure of the homo sacer, the figure who embodies the state of exception, the state that Agamben notes has become the rule of political relations in the public spaces in which we still live. Myriad scholars have unpacked the ways in which the state of exception underpins the ongoing state of emergency that is said to define the contemporary, and in so doing have shown how this condition intensifies the global movements of people and the grip of neoliberal economic policies, and how it deepens inequalities between wealth and health. And this is just a few of very recent headlines showing how the state of emergency is still circulating in our media, even today, at this very moment. Craig Calhoun writes that responses to emergency, for instance, specifically humanitarian and military interventions, appear on the surface to take as their primary aim the alleviation of suffering. But ultimately, these interventions are more invested in restoring and sustaining the existing order of inequality, not in changing it. Calhoun adds, what is also unique about the state of exception and its corollary emergency is that both are actionable. That is, they both come with a demand for action. And what action or intervention imparts, it imparts the appearance of rendering aid or giving care, while what it is actually doing is shoring up the existing order and perpetuating the rule of those in power. On the surface, too, the nature of emergency gives the impression of being temporary, insofar as, by definition, an emergency is a sudden, urgent, usually unexpected occurrence or occasion requiring immediate action, a one-time response to a disaster or crisis. But on the ground, emergency has become endless. Then the state of exception has become the rule. Again, in the words of Agamben, quote, a new juridical political paradigm in which the norm becomes indistinguishable from the exception. In the US, we find a clear example of this exception turned norm in the number of emergency decrees issued by the White House since the passage of the National Emergency Act in 1976. According to the Federal Register, 79 national emergencies have been declared since then, 42 of which are still operative and renewed annually, including, for instance, the emergency declared against Iran by Carter in 1979, the emergency declared by Bush after 9/11, and most recently, the emergency declared by Biden concerning Russian aggression in Ukraine. Added to this national register are the plethora of emergency decrees issued at agency, state, and municipal levels year-round. I make note of these declarations to say that on the day-to-day, especially in the US, we are embedded in a fretwork of emergencies, and therefore immersed in and possibly numbed by an ongoing state of exception to such an extent that perhaps we have lost feeling for its power. In Italy today, the discourse of emergency, according to Eleanor Painter, has become inseparable from migration. Specifically, she argues that emergenza actualizes an imaginary of foreignness that racializes migrants and legitimizes their legal and social exclusion from Italian society. Sites like the Villaggio Attrezzato at l'Arbabuta, as well as migrant detention centers across Italy, themselves once called centers of temporary permanence, concretize in brick and mortar the exclusionary logics linked to emergenza and likewise to citizenship. Of the former, the villaggi were built after a declaration of national emergenza nomadi, a nomad emergency, which freed up government funds to finance the raising of nomad camps and the construction of villages. Of the latter, a series of legislative actions couched under a broad-based umbrella of emergenza migrazione, or migration emergency, just think of the Bossi-Fini law of 2002, created and transmogrified Italy's system of migrant detention centers over the last 3 decades. At sites like the village in the center, as I argued in Empire's Mobius Strip, mobility, and specifically the control of mobility, has proven to be the crucial connective tissue that brings these strands of emergency, exception, and citizenship into contact. Exclusionary logics condition the mobilities of those who move by choice, like tourists, and those who are moved by force, like refugees, dictating who can cross borders and where and when and how they traverse them. Those belonging to a mobile class of global elites are able to pass seamlessly through countries. Each border crossing, each stop at customs is nothing more than a banal formality that is given little fore or afterthought. Their movements are facilitated and even subsidized by governments through programs like Global Entry, Cleared, TSA PreCheck, programs aimed at removing the few remaining obstacles for mobile elites, like time spent waiting in line, and effectively create a borderless world for those deemed by states to be trusted travelers. For those who do not belong to this elite mobile class, border crossings can be traumatic experiences fraught with anxiety and danger. Contrary to the aforementioned trusted travelers, the movements of this vast underclass of people are typically blocked, detoured, rerouted, and pushed back, sometimes ending in detainment and deportation, in other cases, injury and death. By way of example, one need only think of the perilous crossings in the central Mediterranean that end with shipwrecks shipwrecks or sbarchi in and near Lampedusa, or at the southern border of the United States, the deadly passage across the Sonoran Desert that has turned the wilderness into a migrant graveyard. At present, there are 89.3 million forcibly displaced people around the world, according to the UN Refugee Agency, and this number is growing every year. Theirs are movements deemed alarming to state power, and for this reason, they are consistently framed in the rhetoric of emergency and crisis, terms, again, that carry demand for action. And yet the actions taken are primarily those of exclusion, not inclusion. The state dedicates enormous resources to keeping out, turning away, rejecting, distancing, banning, deporting, inter alia, those whose mobilities are not only unsanctioned, but also represented by the wrong documents. Passports in particular signify citizenship. They are an important index for determining exclusion. Even today, passports are labeled strong or weak in accordance with the degrees of mobility they bestow upon their holders. Indeed, fates have been decided, and for some, with life and death consequences, of having the right or the wrong papers issued by the state. In Italy, we find an historical example of such life and death consequences, of exclusionary logics, and of fates determined by papers at the site of Fossoli, a place north of Bologna where the village and the camp meet, both literally and figuratively. It was a site of many names and many classifications. In progression, it was a prison camp for Allied POWs from 1942 to 1943, a concentration camp and deportation camp for Jews from 1943 to 1944, an Allied-run prison for war criminals in 1945, an Italian-run prison for fascists from 1945 to 1946, a camp for post-war refugees, also known as a displaced persons camp, a DP camp in 1947, a Catholic orphanage and humanitarian center from 1947 to 1952, and finally, a village for Istrian exiles, Esuli, known as Villaggio San Marco from 1954 to 1970. As a camp, Fossoli quick-stepped from one administration to another, rapidly turning over in both function and functionaries. I visited Fossoli in the spring of 2016, and my field notes say, the site blends ruin with rebirth. I saw young tree branches bursting through dilapidated barracks, refusing to be contained by any structure. The smell of burning litterfall permeated the air as farmers prepared nearby fields for planting. Chestnut trees lined crumbling fences. Cherry blossom petals floated down around me, carpeting my pathway through the rubble. These were the blooms of the marusticano, a cherry plum that with a slightly bitter taste. I felt as if I had stumbled into the peach orchard of the Kurosawa film Dreams. Yet Fossoli as a camp was hardly bucolic. It gained notoriety during World War II as a concentration camp, and specifically as the transit camp for Italian Jews that served as the antechamber to Nazi lager in Germany and Poland. Italy's most famous survivor of the Shoah, Primo Levi, passed through here en route to Auschwitz. Fossoli was originally constructed in May 1942 as an Allied POW camp, but it changed in September 1943 and was repurposed from POW camp to concentration camp, and in short order, it became a Polizeidurchgangslager, or Gulag, under Nazi rule. Primo Levi's internment lasted here for 1 month between January and February 1944, and according to the Jewish Contemporary Documentation Center in Milan, approximately 3,000 Italian Jews were transported through Fossoli to the extermination camps of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. The CDEC estimates only 12% of all Fossoli deportees survived. Archival records also show that in early 1942, thousands of Jews were deported from or forcibly displaced within what was then still Italian colonial Libya. And their fates quite literally depended on the documents or the papers that they held. Libyan Jews holding French citizenship, for example, who were considered Tunisiens protégés français, were expelled to detention camps in Tunisia and Algeria. Jews holding Libyan citizenship were either conscripted into labor camps, or as was the case for roughly 3,000 Jews from the eastern region of Cyrenaica, They were forcibly displaced from their homes, transported across the country, and interned in the newly built concentration camp of Jado, which is out in the outskirts of the city of Tripoli. Records show that 560 individuals belonging to the Cyrenaican Jewish population died here of malnutrition, disease, and forced labor, a fact that Maurice Rumani has claimed to be, quote, the highest loss of life from all of the Jewish communities in the Middle East and North Africa during the period of the Second World War. Still, too, fate was different for the Libyan Jews holding British citizenship. They were first sent to Italy and then on to Nazi lager. According to Liliana Picciotto, 300 Libyan Jews with British citizenship ended up at Fossoli in early 1944. She describes their internment there as unusual in that the Libyans were separated from Italian Jews in the part of the camp reserved for political prisoners. The living conditions seemed to be slightly better for them, and in an oral history account of the camp, a neighbor described how some Libyan children evaded the control of Italian guards and found themselves in their residence to eat chestnut cake. Primo Levi also wrote of the Libyan Jews at Fossoli in his acclaimed memoir, If This Is a Man. Quote, they came from Tripoli by way of many long voyages and always brought with them their tools of trade and cooking pots and accordions and violin to play and dance after the day of work. And they were happy and pious people. Levy goes on to describe the Libyan Jews' anticipatory grief for the journey to Nazi lager yet to come. And when all was ready, the focaccia cooked, the bundles tied, they then took off their shoes, unloosened their hair, and arranged the funeral candles on the ground, and lit them according to the custom of their fathers. And they sat on the ground in a circle for the lamentation, praying and weeping all night. Many of us stopped in front of their door, and there descended into the soul new for us the ancient grief of a populace that has no land, the grief without hope of the exodus renewed in every century. The 300 Libyan Jews remained at Fossoli for just a few days before being deported to Bergen-Belsen in 4 successive departures. The length of the Libyan Jews' stay at Bergen-Belsen varied. Some stayed for just a few days, others for months. Picciotto notes that all the Libyan Jews deported to Bergen-Belsen were eventually transferred to less severe internment camps within the system of lager, including Liebenau, Vittel, and Biberach. For this reason, almost all of the Libyan Jews deported from Fossoli, quite surprisingly, survived their time in the lager. This is not to say that their conditions of internment were anything less than harsh. Rumani notes that German guards treated Libyan Jews with particular cruelty. They were punished for maintaining their rituals of daily prayer and holding to the kashrut, or the Jewish dietary laws. They were also isolated because of their geographic origin as well as their language, Arabic. They endured famine, beatings, and solitary confinement. Yet even among those deleterious conditions, there were moments of grace. For instance, in July 1944, unbeknownst to the Nazi guards, a son was born to 2 Libyan Jews, Hamus Burbea and Jonah Giora, while they were interned in Bergen-Belsen. This son, Daniele Burbea, spent the first year of his life in this lager, and he, along with his immediate family, all survived the Shoah. And many Libyan Jews found their way home after Allied troops liberated the lager. Picciotto describes the journey of one group who was freed from the Vittel camp. They crossed France, Spain, and Portugal by train before seeking refuge at the British consulate in Lisbon. From the Portuguese capital, they took a boat to Casablanca, where they stayed in a refugee camp for 2 months, most likely here at Camp Fadala in Morocco, where Allied forces had established a free port for victims rescued from Nazi Europe. Then the group took a train to Algiers, and after a weeks-long delay, they finally boarded a ship for Tripoli. 2 years and 9 months after their initial arrest by Italian colonial authorities, following their traumatic odyssey through camps at Fossoli, Bergen-Belsen, Vittel, and finally Fadala, this group of Libyan Jews returned home. For Libyan Jews on the whole, their fates had been bound to citizenship, to the papers that they held, which from these members of this very tight-knit community designated how, where, and when they could move, relegating some to labor camps, others to death at Jadu, and still others to Nazi lager. What is more, the survival of the 300 Libyan Jews deported to Fossoli seems to complicate the Agamben concept of the Homo Sacer, as well as the idea of the concentration camp as the spatialization of the state of exception. Theirs was a double exclusion within the camp, for as Libyans, they gave off the appearance and dress, custom, and language of actual Musulmaner living among the figurative Musulmaner of the camp. This difference, this extra degree of exclusion, seems to have provided for separate living conditions that, through isolation, reinforced the communal bonds that enabled their survival in this space beleaguered by bare life. In contrast, the journey of the majority of Jews deported from another Italian possession, Rhodes and the Dodecanese Islands, ended with death in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. Of the 2,000 Jewish inhabitants of the Dodecanese, all but 50 were sent to Nazi lager in July 1944, and almost all of them perished. The 50 who had remained behind held Turkish citizenship and fell under protection of the Turkish consulate. It is interesting to note that throughout Italy's occupation of Rhodes and the Dodecanese from approximately 1911 to 1943, the idea of similarity between Italy and Greece was a constant leitmotif. Shared Mediterranean kinship purportedly linked the two geographies, best expressed by the popular trope una faccia, una razza, one face, one race. In this case, we might ask how the inclusion of Rhodes and the Dodecanese, and by extension Rhodian Jews within the ambit of Italy and to a greater extent Europe, actually led to a fate different from that facilitated by the double exclusion of Libyan Jews. To put it another way, we might ask how and why in this instance inclusion led to death and exclusion led to life, a fact that seems to run counter to the conventional wisdom that espouses the benefits of moral and political inclusion in state and society vis-a-vis citizenship. This brings us back to my original question of how exclusionary logics of citizenship operate over the longue durée. We know from Agamben that the notion of the ban, the root of our words like abandonment and banishment, is the articulating force behind the exercise of sovereign power, a force predicated on the act of expulsion from community. In this case, without going into too many details, the Homo Sacer, who is banished through the sacrifice of his life, and who in turn is made sacred in death. The Homo Sacer is a figure rooted in Roman law, whose ban advanced a constellation of power that is specifically localizable here to Rome, specifically to ancient Rome. And to expand our idea of exclusionary logics, I would like to turn our attention to a different ban and a different constellation of power in ancient Athens, and arguably the original polis where modern concepts of citizenship first took root. The power I'm referring to here is that of the demos, or demokratia, the democracy, and the ban I'm concerned with is the institution of ostrakismos, or ostracism. Similar to the relationship between Homo Sacer and sovereign power in Rome, there was a strong connection between banishment and political power in Athens. Yet the ways in which the ban was carried out, however, were antithetical to one another. Unlike the sovereign who had the power to make live and let die, in the Athenian polis, banishment was institutionalized, exercised in moderation, limited in time, and most importantly, voted on by its citizens. I first learned about this practice while I was living in Athens, writing Empire's Mobius Strip. At least once a week, I made it a point to walk down to the Parthenon and through the Agora. I had thought that walking through the place where democracy was born would help me to understand empire in new ways. One day I went into the Agora Museum in the Stoa of Attalos, and I stumbled across a display of potsherds inscribed with names of men, usually with a pithy comment or two on them as well. I discovered that these were the artifacts of a practice called ostrakismos. In very broad strokes, ostrakismos consisted of Athenian citizens coming together on an annual basis to vote a single person out of the polis, a practice that peaked in the 5th century BCE. It was a procedure, according to Brill's New Pauli, that, quote, permitted the expulsion of a man from the country for 10 years without having been convicted of an offense, but without confiscating his property. Athenian citizens would vote to decide whether or not they wanted to hold an ostracism, would first vote to decide whether or not they wanted to hold an ostracism in that year, and if yes, they took a second vote using these potsherds, or ostraka, as write-in ballots which bore the names of citizens that they wanted to expel. A quorum of 6,000 votes was necessary to ostracize a citizen who, upon results of the vote, would be exiled from Athens for a decade, after which he could return to the polis with both his property and citizenship rights intact. In the simplest of terms, ostracismo served as a deterrent to violent political conflicts between rival elites. According to Sarah Forsdyke, it evolved to counter the destabilizing societal effects of intra-elite conflict that frequently resulted in violence, as well as arbitrary expulsions from earlier Greek city-states. Other scholars have argued that the purpose of ostracism was to prevent tyrannies, or rule by a tyrant. As a practice, however, Forsdyke adds that ostracism was largely symbolic. The historical record shows that only 13 ostracisms were carried out in Athens between 487 and 415 BCE. So it can be better viewed as a collective ritual that strengthened individual and communal attachments to the polis, and above all else, a means of legitimating the rule by the demos. Ostracism was a means to negotiate citizenship, that is, the membership in the polis. It actualized, returning again to the words of Daphne Berdahl, this ongoing process, social complex, and cultural performance, that is, citizenship. In this way, we can see the exclusionary logics were not only built into, but also had a material effect on democratic processes from their very beginning. In ancient Athens, citizens collectively managed exclusion and thus democracy by regularly putting them to vote. And yet, to be a citizen in Athens was predicated on exclusion. One had to be an adult male. Women, slaves, children, and resident foreigners were all ineligible. Further, men had to have been born freely to an Athenian father, an early form of birthright citizenship. Athenian citizenship excluded the majority of people living in the polis, and citizenship available only to the very few was far more exclusionary than inclusive, even in a direct democracy like Athens. With ostrakismos, we can see the exclusionary logics of citizenship have been knitted into democracy from its very beginning. This disposition, this impulse to exclude gathered strength as it grew in breadth and depth with, for instance, banishment and sacrifice of the homosacre here in Rome under Roman law. And over the longue durée, states have dedicated more and more energy and money to carrying out exclusionary logics, investing in ever-expanding apparatuses of exclusion justified by an unending state of exception and emergency. In the US, we can see recent examples of the ways in which exclusionary logics manifest in sites like the border wall and migrant detention centers. This exclusionary impulse, too, has spilled over even to those who are citizens in practices like gerrymandering, redlining, and bail bondage, citizens who are deemed by those in power to be unworthy of rights like voting, housing, and fair trials. In Italy, we see the relationship between exclusion and citizenship play out at sites like La Barbuta and Fossoli, and in fraught bureaucratic practices like applying for asylum, visas, or permessi di soggiorno, permits of stay. This exclusionary drive manifests most acutely at migrant detention centers, like this one here at Ponte Galeria, which is classified as a centro di identificazione e espulsione, or center for identification and expulsion. Here, both processes, identification and expulsion, hinge upon a detainee's declaration of citizenship and the state's either refusal or acceptance of that claim. If refused, the person is expelled from the state, and expulsion, according to Saskia Sassen, has become the defining condition of our times. Sassen names this the savage sorting, this exponentially growing number of people, enterprises, and places expelled from core social and economic orders. Vast energies are dedicated to expulsion, not least because vast fortunes are also to be made from it. One need only think of migration and the illegality industry it sustains, this industry that centers on matters of citizenship and that generates, by some estimates, trillions per year for the global economy. This includes billions in contracts to build and operate detention centers like this one, to run border patrols, to fund reception services, not to mention, on the other end of things, the fees and bribes paid to traffickers and smugglers, the taxes paid, and remittances sent home by undocumented workers, to name just a few. With such focus on exclusion, I want to conclude by asking, what would happen if we put just some of that time and energy into inclusion instead? Exclusionary logics are powerful, yes, and they have operated over the longue durée. But what changes would we see in our community if we reoriented ourselves, even to a small degree, toward including people rather than excluding them? And imagine what changes might come about if we reset our default to inclusion rather than exclusion. Perhaps we would see something like the newly inaugurated Welcome Corps in the United States, which allows groups of private citizens to sponsor incoming refugees. This initiative is still so new. It was announced only by Secretary of State Blinken on January 19th, that we know very little about it and how it will actually play out on the ground. But in its intention, the Welcome Corps seems to advocate for reception rather than refusal. Or perhaps we might see something like that, what happened in southern Italy in the small town of Riace. Since the late 1990s, the town's mayor, Domenico Lucano, made a concerted effort to welcome migrants, transforming the once depopulated and depressed Riace into a model of integration whereby migrants and residents together worked on various community development projects funded by the EU and the Italian state. In Riace, the attitude toward migrants was inclusion, not exclusion, and for almost 2 decades, the town thrived economically and culturally in contrast to the surrounding region in Calabria. In a 2016 interview with the BBC, Mayor Lucano said he hoped the story of Riace would, quote, spread a message of hope, humanity, and anti-racism to the world. But the story of Riace would not have a happy ending. 2 years later, in 2018, after the Lega came to power with Matteo Salvini at its helm, Mayor Lucano was arrested and convicted of the crime of aiding and abetting illegal immigration and for irregularities in managing asylum seekers. With the example of Riace, we can see just how hard it is to stand counter to the forces of exclusion. And at the moment when inclusion seems to gain a foothold, the exclusionary drive returns with amplified force. Riace is now a ghost town. Almost all of the migrants who once resided there have left. Mayor Lucano lives under house arrest, and his conviction is currently under appeal. His fate, like the town's, remains uncertain. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful talk, and let's take questions. Tana?
Yes. Hi, Stephanie. That was tremendously interesting and very moving. I have a big question, which is, why do you think states today are investing so much in exclusion? You mentioned some of the economic benefits for tourism firms, specific people, but then more than why.
I think I tried to get to that a little bit by going back to Keynote, that it's been embedded within our conceptions of democracy from the very beginning, right? That we're not even aware or conscious of this, but that it's been part of the practice of this purported, democratic governance. That I think calling attention to it and raising our awareness around it will hopefully make us see how these logics become actualized in practice and where they're coming from. So I think that would be the answer. And certainly, I'm not a classicist. If there's any classicists in the room, they might know more about this practice of stoicismos. But I think it's something to really think about. There's a lot of scholarship around Gamba and Roman law, but I think this other practice, stoicismos, this is a counterpoint, a very interesting counterpoint, because it was exclusion managed by the community, like the collective, which is different than exclusion managed by sovereign, by a singular king. So, in that sense, my question would become: is there a different genealogy that emerges from stoicismos versus from soccer? What kind of sites of exclusion or we can actualize out of that. I don't know the answer to that yet, but I think it would be an interesting thing.
So what I noted and I thought was so interesting is the kind of deep contingencies through which space is racialized here, right? That one status can change, right? Contemporary status can change depending on which side, especially in the case of volunteers. But I was wondering if you could speak more broadly about these kinds of racial hierarchies that were manifest in the time of colonialism and their resonances today.
That's a great question, and I know there are papers tomorrow will address that. So I feel, on one hand, as leaving that to some of the other scholars, but I did want to know what was interesting, particularly about the migrant detention centers. When I was doing field work in that site at Contestations, which is, if you take the train from Fiumicino, you pass right by it, and nobody gives it a second thought. But the people who are detained often play with the concept of citizenship. They give false claims to citizenship because in that way, it extends their stay. It's the process. So is identification. And identification is identifying the citizenship, where the state in which you are from citizenship. And someone would say, I'm from Tunisia, and they're really from Morocco or from somewhere else. And the consular representative in Tunisia will have to come down to the center to identify, right? And then the representative gets down and says, this person's not from Tunisia. And so it extends the stay there. And then eventually, kind of what happens is there's this game that's played, right? So there is a kind of agency on the part of people detained there using citizenship as a tool, as a strategy. And a lot of times what happens is that the bureaucratic process people just give up and then they're released with a folio de carta de vida. But in this sense, I thought it was very interesting, I didn't mention this in the talk, but the way in which the naming and the claiming of citizenship can be used as a strategy and a tool for agency is something that definitely needs further investigation.
So I see Preeti, Stuart, and then Silvana.
Thanks for your great talk. I have a sort of question relating to this, the exclusionary logic which informing citizenship. Thongchai Winnichikul, in his book on Thailand, talks about how nationalism is normally informed by a negative logics. So it's rather than actually saying that what we are, it's like what we are not. And so I wonder if some of this exclusionary logics for citizenship is a way of actually being then informing what is citizenship, and if you could comment on that.
No, that's a great question and comment, and I think certainly in the case of Italy, there is a long and rich history of defining Italian identity vis-a-vis difference. Right? We are Italian because we're not French. Right? But I think it's more complicated in the case of Italy because of the heterogeneity of the place. We all know Italy was late in becoming a nation. 1961, and even then, there's still these kind of fraught processes of national nation-making and identity. I will say what's very interesting about this kind of exclusionary logics is that even at the moment that Italy becomes a nation, right, famously that Italy is unified, and at that moment it also kind of, the southern question emerges, right, the questione meridionale, that Italy is split into two, north and south at that moment. And there's a lot of resistance in the south to the unification. There's scholarship around brigandage, et cetera. In 1863, the newly formed Italian parliament passes something that's called the Pica Law. And the Pica Law makes it a crime to criminalizes any kind of resistance to the Italian state. It also creates a carceral archipelago in Italy. So islands like Ustica, Ponza, Lampedusa today, the Tremiti Islands. And these were islands where primarily southern Italians in the mid to after 1863 were sent, right? They were being excluded from the nation. They were sent into punishment of domicilio coatto, or forced domicile. And so at the moment that Italy's coming together, there's this immediate, not just exclusion, but also criminalization right, of the South. And I would also say that shortly thereafter, we have many kind of exclusionary movements for forced domicile. And we remember, too, that by the 1880s, there were huge waves of Italian immigrants leaving for the Americas and for the Antipodes. And so the moment that Italy, becomes a nation, it's losing most of its citizenry. Right? We have that famous saying by Massimo d'Azeglio, with Italy made, now we must make the Italians. And so I think there's, yes, exclusion, but there's also this sense of loss and belatedness, and this is beset kind of Italian national identity since the very outset. Stuart?
This was a really fascinating discussion about gradations of citizenship and exclusion. Thank you very, very much. A question for me, which occurs because many of us are nomads or able to move, not seamlessly, but somewhat easily through the borders. And it's my understanding that the notion of national borders is a relatively new one. The idea of enforcing that. I'm wondering if those two things are simultaneous, the appearance or the emergence of citizenship as a concept of exclusion and the use of enforcement of borders.
That's a great question, and several years ago I co-edited a special journal issue called Borderless Italy, Italy Without Borders, and we took this to task. And one of the things we're doing at UC Santa Barbara is we've instituted this new transnational Italian studies major, and transnational Italian studies is sort of emerging as a field insofar as we are thinking about Italy as developing in relation to other cultures, languages, and histories, trans in the sense of transcending, moving across, beyond, and through borders itself. And those borders, I think we need to think of borders not just as territorial, but also cultural, linguistic, psychic, because the border is famously a very malleable thing, right? If we think about just Italy, think specifically about territorial borders, the borders of the Italian nation state have changed a number of times throughout history. And I know there's going to be papers on that here, scholars who work on that here in this room. But I think specifically, borders, how would I answer this? I think the site of the border is interesting because it also represents competing legal jurisdictions. And I'm thinking specifically of like the Lampedusa, the case of Lampedusa and the waters around Lampedusa. So for those of you who don't know, Lampedusa is an island about 200 kilometers south of Sicily. It's closer to Tunisia. It is the place where the site of the central Mediterranean past the southernmost point of Europe, where migrants coming from Eastern Africa, Western Africa, making their way across the Sahara, tend to board on boats and then get to Europe, and kind of usually shipwrecked or rescued off the coast of Lampedusa. But the waters around Lampedusa are governed by Italian law, they're governed by EU jurisdiction, they're governed by international law, and they're governed by maritime law. And all of these jurisdictions conflict with one another, right? So in Italy, it's actually a crime to aid a migrant, right? It's a crime of solidarity. 2018, it was made illegal. And you can be fined if an Italian fisherman picked up a migrant from a shipwreck in the water. You could be fined up to, I think it was almost 150,000 euros. You'd be charged with a crime. And this runs counter to both international law and EU law and maritime law, which mandates the rescue, right? And so the border, and there's the contention of where is the border? Is this Italian sea? Is this international sea? And so there's this really fraught space of conflict in which border and jurisdiction and legality, citizenship all come into this kind of both a fraught space and an ambiguous space too.
What about the evolution of those two ideas together? That's really the crux of what I'm asking. That do they sort of appear at the same time, the enforcement of borders and the kind of strengthening or the clarifying or the exclusionary use of citizenship?
I think for thinking specifically about the case of the Italian nation state, you go back to the example I gave you, the Pica Law, yes, then there's this moment where citizenship is emerging, like Italian citizenship, and yet a whole host of Southerners are excluded from that because of their opposition to the state. But like I said, I think that the malleability of borders brings that into question. I mean, there's just too many examples that are contrary to that I think I can't make a broad generalization. But I think if I could say at the moment of unification, then yes.
I think also if we think generally about the creation of borders and nation states, it's simultaneous to the birth of the passport. So defining with documents who's in and who's out. Silvana?
Oh yeah, so thanks for this fascinating talk. I was thinking that if we try to understand, right, the issue of why all this takes place, right, we need to understand sort of the relationship with politics and capitalism, right? Because I see that there is certainly a tendency to exclusion, but there are also moments of inclusion, right, that are also linked to some sort of different political ideologies. And if I think about this central moment for definition of citizenship and nation, which is the French Revolution, if you think about a constitution that is more radical, right, more progressive, like the Constitution of 1793, which is in fact a constitution that was never implemented because of the terror and because of the Directorate afterwards, the terminal afterwards. You think about a definition of naturalization, which is very extensive, right? And so you can imagine different possibilities. And I think about sort of moments of, right, acceptance of immigrants, of course, defined as whites from Europe, and then the closure with the quota laws in the States. So there are sort of variations that are important for understanding also, right? Variation of inclusion that are important for understanding exclusion.
I think the example you bring up, France, is very important. The kind of looking toward naturalization as there, particularly to inform the Italian nation in Piedmont, the Italian nation process in Italy. And I think you're right, the moments of inclusion are important to look at. But I would also say, for me, I was more thinking about why these exclusionary logics were operating, right? And specifically, I've been thinking a lot recently about proto-national forms of belonging, like in places like Venice and Genoa. And this is talking about the book project, but with this Mediterranean system of bondage, enslaved in the Barbary Coast, from 1500 to 1800, there was a whole network of redemptive operations in which places like Genoa and Venice, Genoa in particular, had an entire magistrate dedicated to ransoming and bringing home Genovese citizens, I use that in quotes, from their capture in places like Algiers and Tripoli and Tunis. And that this is a huge operation in which these republics were bringing back into inclusion people who had been captive, taken primarily by corsairs. And so thinking about that, and that absolutely has to do with capitalism, your first point, because there was more to be made, not necessarily on the bondage of the person, but in the trade of the person, in the ransom of the person. So it was more about getting money back for bringing the person home to Genoa, Venice, or so on and so forth. So what does that mean for citizenship? Right? How did you know you belonged to the Republic of Venice? What declared you a nation? What declared you a Genovese? Right? I'm still thinking through this, but I think there's these operations of redemption that create this network that bring these other citizens, if I lack of a better term, back into the fold, back into to places like Genoa and Venice. It's very interesting.
Angelica.
Hi, thank you so much, Stephanie, for this wonderful lecture. I was thinking, you mentioned a lot to Lambert, and I wanted to know, what do you think? I don't know if you're aware of that. He refused to sign a petition against you solely.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering what you think about that.
There's a lot, there's a lot of critique around his work, and I think I don't necessarily agree with some of his more recent actions. I think what I'm using his theory as kind of, because it's so cited all the time about, for the scholarship around exception, exclusion, the camp, that's why I'm using it in this talk. My critique of Agamben is he not only uses Sophie's, but he doesn't deal with the colonial past, right? He doesn't acknowledge Italy's roles in colonialism. And in fact, Italy had a system, built a system of 16 concentration camps in Libya from 1929 to 1933 that predicated the system of Nazi lager. And in the book, I talk about how this system of camps kind of perfected these techniques of sedentarization, exclusion, and and this is something that Agamben doesn't deal with. And how did those camps and that experience, the Italian fascist colonial regime, influence or inform or anything, the Nazi system of lager, where, as Agamben would say, it becomes this absolute biopolitical machine in which death is just mechanized, instrumentalized. So that would be my critique, and I don't think there's a lot more to be said about that we can talk about, but I think his unacknowledgement of the colonial past, as well as
The idea of citizenship.
and of citizenship, yeah. Mussolini's connected, and we could discuss that in further detail.
I think that we will conclude here. We'll thank Stephanie. So we will reconvene here at 2:30 after lunch.